Halloween had always been my favorite holiday, a day where the veil between the living and the dead seemed to thin, where the impossible felt possible. This year was special. I had just moved into a new house and was eager to host my first Halloween party there. I spent weeks preparing, turning my home into a haunted mansion complete with cobwebs, flickering lights, and eerie sound effects. My friends began to arrive as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced in the flickering candlelight. They were dressed in an array of costumes, from classic witches and vampires to pop culture icons. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional blood-curdling scream from a well-executed prank. Around 10 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. The door creaked open, and a figure dressed as the Grim Reaper walked in. The costume was unsettlingly authentic, complete with a scythe that looked dangerously real. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, assuming he was a friend of a friend. After all, Halloween is the one night a year when you open your door to strangers, right? As the night wore on, I noticed that the Grim Reaper was an anomaly in the festive atmosphere. He stood in a dimly lit corner, his face hidden beneath the hood, watching but never participating. He didn't eat, drink, or speak. He just observed. It was as if he was waiting for something, or someone. I felt a growing sense of unease. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was letting my imagination run wild. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at me. I decided to do some detective work. Casually, I began to ask my friends if they knew who was behind the mask. Each query was met with a puzzled look and a shake of the head. No one knew who he was. No one had invited him. My heart began to race. The room was filled with my closest friends, yet here was a complete stranger among us, hidden behind a mask and a cloak. The gravity of the situation began to sink in. We had let something, into our sanctuary, and we had no idea what their intentions were. Summoning up courage, I decided it was time to confront the Grim Reaper. I walked over to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey, you've got an amazing costume. Really authentic," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who do you know here?" For a moment, he just stood there, silent, as if contemplating how to respond. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the house, his cloak trailing behind him. The door slammed shut, and he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the night. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was tinged with a sense of unease. Who was he? Why had he come? And more importantly, why had he left? The party continued, but the mood had shifted. Conversations were punctuated by nervous glances at the door, and there was a palpable sense of relief when the clock struck midnight, signaling the end of Halloween. The next morning, I was jolted awake by a phone call. It was my neighbor, sounding panicked. "Did you hear? There were a series of break-ins last night," she said. "The police are saying the intruder was dressed as the Grim Reaper." My blood turned to ice. We had welcomed a stranger into our home, not knowing the danger we were inviting in. It was a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving, especially on a night when everyone is in disguise. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't confronted him. Had we narrowly escaped a terrible fate, or was he just a lost soul looking for a place to belong? I guess we'll never know. That's what haunts me the most.
My friends and I had always been thrill seekers, always on the hunt for our next adventure. We had explored abandoned buildings, gone skydiving, and even tried our hands at ghost hunting. But nothing prepared us for what we would experience on Halloween night. The idea came from Jake, the unofficial leader of our group. "Why don't we go for a hike on the Talking Woods Trail? You know, the one that's supposed to be haunted?" he suggested, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Talking Woods was infamous in our town. It was a beautiful trail by day, but by night it transformed into something else entirely. There were stories of hikers hearing whispers in the wind, of seeing shadowy figures that disappeared upon second glance, and even of people going missing, never to be found again. Naturally, we were intrigued. We met at the trailhead just as the sun was setting, casting an orange glow that slowly turned to twilight. We were armed with flashlights, a first aid kit, and of course, our phones to capture any paranormal activity. "Are you guys ready?" Jake asked, his eyes twinkling with excitement. We all nodded, some more hesitantly than others, and began our trek into the woods. At first, it was like any other hike. We were surrounded by the sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder despite it being a relatively warm autumn night. A dense fog rolled in, enveloping us in a misty haze. The path, which had been clear until now, seemed to twist and turn in confusing patterns. And then, we heard it. Footsteps. The footsteps were faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the forest. But as we continued, they grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone or something was following us. We stopped in our treks, our flashlights scanning the darkness behind us. There was nothing there. Probably just an animal, said Emily, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. We resumed our hike, but the footsteps persisted, mirroring our pace. The tension among us was palpable. We were no longer talking, no longer laughing. We were listening, waiting. Then, out of nowhere, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. It was so loud, so full of anguish, that it seemed to reverberate through the very trees around us. We were paralyzed for a moment, our hearts pounding in our chests. Then, instinct kicked in, and we ran. As we sprinted back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched, that the footsteps were closing in on us. When we finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing where our cars were parked, we were met with a sight that stopped us in our tracks. Muddy handprints covered the windows of our cars, as if someone had been peering inside. We drove home in stunned silence, each lost in our thoughts, grappling with what we had just experienced. Later, we discovered that a hiker had gone missing on that trail several years ago and was never found. His last known location, the very spot where we had heard the scream. Whether it was the spirit of the missing hiker or something else entirely, we knew we were not alone in those woods that night. And none of us have ventured back into Talking Woods since, haunted by the memories of that Halloween night.
College life was a whirlwind of experiences, a mix of late-night study sessions, parties, and forging friendships that promised to last a lifetime. I shared an apartment with 3 of my closest friends, Sarah, Mark, and Emily. We were inseparable, each of us bringing something unique to our little family. Halloween was a big deal for us. We had always celebrated it together, whether it was by going to a party or staying in for a horror movie marathon. This year, we had decided on the latter. We stocked up on popcorn, candy, and a collection of the scariest films we could find. However, on the day itself, Mark and Emily decided to go to a last-minute party, leaving Sarah and me to carry on with our original plan. Sarah seemed a bit off that night, quieter than usual, but I attributed it to the stress of midterms. We settled into the living room, dimmed the lights, and started our movie marathon. About halfway through the first movie, Sarah got up. "I'm not feeling too well. I think I'm going to lie down," she said, her voice tinged with fatigue. "Sure, get some rest. We can always continue this another time," I replied, pausing the movie as she left the room. I considered joining Mark and Emily at the party, but decided against it. Instead, I resumed the movie, losing myself in the on-screen terror. Time seemed to fly by, and before I knew it, it was close to midnight. That's when I heard it. The front door creaking open and then shutting softly. I assumed it was Mark and Emily returning from their party, so I didn't think much of it. But then, footsteps began to approach the living room. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty hallway. I turned around, expecting to see Mark and Emily, perhaps even Sarah, who might have felt better and decided to rejoin me. But there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the flickering images on the TV screen. A sense of dread washed over me. I quickly turned off the TV and stood up, my ears straining to catch any sound. Silence. I decided to check on Sarah, thinking maybe she had gotten up and was the source of the footsteps. I knocked softly on her door. No answer. I knocked again, a bit louder this time. Still no response. Finally, I opened the door, only to find her room empty. Her bed was neatly made, and her phone lay on her nightstand, untouched. It was as if she had never been there. Panic set in. I searched the entire apartment, calling out her name, but there was no sign of her. I even checked the front door. It was locked from the inside. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. We filed a missing person report the next day, but the police found no evidence of foul play. Her family was notified, and they were as baffled as we were. Sarah had no reason to run away. She had been doing well in school and had a loving family and friends. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and there was still no sign of her. We eventually had to pack up her belongings and send them to her family. It was a somber day, a stark reminder of the empty space she had left behind. To this day, her disappearance remains a mystery. We've all moved on in various ways, but the questions remain, haunting us. Where did she go? Why did she leave? And most importantly, could we have done something to prevent it? Every Halloween, I find myself thinking about that night, about the footsteps and the empty room. And I can't shake off the feeling that something terrible happened, something that we're all still struggling to understand.